everybody. Hello, so welcome to our Resist NATO Coalition webinar on the history of NATO expansion, 75 years of aggression, conquest, and the people's resistance. Thank you so much for joining us today and continuing your activism and your education with us. So I think we're gonna go ahead and get started as people continue to come in. And just a reminder, there is going to be a question and answer session. There's going to be a discussion session in the middle of this as well. So if you have questions throughout, you can put them in the chat, you can write them down, and there will be opportunities for us to share them. And yeah, I think let's get started. We can show the agenda for you all, just so you can kind of get a glimpse of what we're going to review today. So we're going to kind of start, this is sort of an overall, introduction into NATO. We'll start with, NATO's beginnings, present day, what NATO's plans are for the future, the people's resistance to NATO, and during our discussion, we'll also kind of tie some of NATO and how NATO's actions and things that NATO is doing is related to present day events that are happening, current events. So what is the Resist NATO Coalition? I think Sarah was going to talk about this. So Sarah, whenever you're ready.
For sure. Hi, everybody. Thank you all for joining us today. This is our first webinar, so very exciting, put on by the Education Committee. So the Resist NATO Coalition is a broad alliance of organizations that are really united in seeing NATO as this US-led military alliance that is essentially used as like the tool of imperialism to secure like their economic interests in other countries, and to also lead these like counterinsurgency programs that really target and seek to quell the resistance that's happening around the world to imperialism. So we're really united and seeing the importance of us coming together to resist NATO this summer, because for folks who don't know, NATO is actually holding their annual summit in DC from July 9th to 11th. So we're planning like a week of action, to get involved in opposing that. And I believe Cody just dropped the links in the chat to our link tree, which has more information about our coalitions or about our committees that you can join, as well as more information about our counter summit and mobilization. So if anyone has any questions like surrounding that as well, just feel free to let us know. And I believe I will pass it back for the next part.
Thanks, Sarah. Yes, we're going to get started with Chelsea's section on NATO's early start in the Cold War. So take it away, Chelsea.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Chelsea, and let's get started on NATO's early start to the Cold War. All right, next slide. So NATO was founded in 1949. And actually, I have the founding charter right here. I'm going to drop the link in the chat. You can read it all there. And from its origins, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization explicitly stated it was an alliance of American and Western European powers that were formed to address the perceived hostilities from the Soviet Union and communist governments, along with the fear of nuclear arms. The agreement states that if one of its members is attacked, the attack is seen as an attack on the whole alliance, and the allies will respond in kind. And I want to note that there's no mention of Russia, Soviet Union, or communism within the treaty itself. Okay, next slide. And I get someone to read the first event.
I can read. 1950, Korean War begins. NATO reacts by implementing a military structure.
Thank you. And I want to mention that prior to the Korean War, the NATO was just, which was about a year after it was signed, it just remained a paper document. Okay, will someone help me with the next event?
In 1954 to 1955, Soviet Union attempts to join NATO to preserve peace. They were rejected. West Germany was allowed to rearm and join NATO. In response, the Soviet Union created the Warsaw Pact with Eastern European countries.
Thank you. And the pact was seen as a balancer to NATO. There are no, as you know, it's the Cold War. There's no real direct conflict between the two entities, but there are like really violent proxy wars like the Korean War, Vietnam, the Bay of Pigs, and the Cambodian Vietnam Wars. Thank you. So who can read 1959?
I can. 1959, Charles de Gaulle, President of France,
Yes.
accuses UK and US of having a special relationship that influences NATO. France withdraws from NATO's military structure.
What France also does is ban standing foreign nuclear. So they banned holding foreign nuclear weapons in its territory, which really upset the Americans because they couldn't station their like nuclear weapons like closer to Russia. Eventually, within the 21st century, they do eventually within the 21st century they do come back into NATO, but you're seeing the cracks of where even NATO countries itself are seeing like some of their autonomy being taken away. So will somebody read 1974? Okay.
1974, serious conflict emerges between two NATO members, Greece and Turkey. The US refuses to intervene. Lack of intervention in this conflict between two NATO member countries highlights that NATO is only concerned with the US's strategic objectives.
Oh, thank you. And you're seeing what's happening is it's becoming more clear to people what NATO is, and like why it's operating. The only time the NATO the article that invokes response an attack in response to an attack of aggression is Article 5, and the only other time it was invoked was during September 11th. Will someone read the last event for me?
1989 to 1991, Soviet Union and Eastern European country with communist governments fall, and NATO looks to establish a new purpose.
Perfect. Thank you, guys. All right. Now, this is a really long slide. If I could get someone to read the quotes, and you can stop it, the sentences are really long, but you can stop in the middle and then we can move on and someone else can pick up afterwards. You can start us off. Okay. Since the end of the Cold War, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, one could in fact argue that far from strengthening European security, NATO, by precluding the creation of any kind of coordinated autonomous European defense, has actually weakened the member states that compose it. Anyone want to read the next part?
On the other hand, if you look at the history of US debates around the alliance and its function, really from its inception when the pact turned into an organization at the turn of the 1950s, there was quite self-conscious recognition of the fact that this was an excellent vehicle for defending US interests in Europe and preventing the emergence of any rival power that might threaten to hegemonize the continent. So in that respect, one has to say that there are deep continuities in NATO's functioning, and it has been quite remarkable success.
Thank you guys. So NATO, from its origins, was always meant to be a force to control European rivals from its inception. And I want everyone to keep, so from the get-go, it was never meant to be any sort of liberating force for democracy. You can read more of Gray Anderson's work. He does a lot on NATO post-Cold War, and I'm going to drop his book he edited in the chat. Okay, thank you guys. And Katie, I believe you're next.
Yes, next up we have Katie on post-Cold War to present day. And again, for those who just joined, if you could introduce yourself in the chat, your name, your organization, where you're calling from, and please remain on mute unless you are actively, reading and participating. There will be opportunities for question and answers and discussion throughout the presentation. And yeah, Katie, take it away.
Sorry, I'm Katie. I'm with Irish Americans for Palestine in Alexandria, Virginia. So we have this grounding now in like the founding of NATO and what the purpose of NATO's founding was, right? Like I really want to make sure that we are grounded in the fact that it was never supposed to be a liberating force. And so we're going to now dive into NATO post-Cold War through the present. And the biggest theme here that I want people to be thinking about and be aware of is NATO's expansion, including past the borders of Europe. So as you can see here, right, this really helpful illustration shows us kind of the way that NATO has grown and expanded. And following the end of the Soviet Union in '91, NATO promised not to expand into the Eastern European countries and promised not to encroach on Russian borders. These promises were immediately broken by NATO. They encouraged former Warsaw Pact countries to join, and 16 countries have joined NATO between 1999 and the present. So I'm going to briefly go through this timeline and delve into some of these events a little more in subsequent slides. So from 91 to 2011, right, we can see that NATO broke its promise in terms of not expanding further into Eastern Europe, not recruiting former members of the Soviet bloc. In the mid-90s, there was the campaign of bombing Yugoslavia, a massive bombing campaign and troop deployment, including occupation in Yugoslavia. And that goes into 1999, in which NATO bombed Kosovo and took similar violent measures. In the early 2000s, as was said previously, Article 5 was enacted, and so NATO's campaign extends beyond Europe post 9/11 through the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan. And NATO had a training mission to install the pro-US Iraqi military in 2004. In 2009, we see Operation Ocean Shield in the Gulf of Aden to address Somalian pirates. This led to the deaths and warrantless arrests of many poor fisher folk. And then 2011 in Libya, NATO's airstrikes against Gaddafi and the government led to over 70 confirmed civilian deaths. So NATO throughout its history has been an arm of US warfare, and that's really a massive part of the intention of NATO. So the first direct mobilization, like army mobilization in NATO history, was actually against Iraq in the invasion of Kuwait, which was a major source of US oil imports. Right, the bombing campaign and occupation of Yugoslavia and Kosovo in the 90s brings NATO closer to Russian territory, which again violates that promise against Eastern expansion, and also again is about keeping what are considered enemies of NATO and specifically enemies of the US in check. And then we see the NATO campaigns expand beyond Europe with the use of Article 5, the invasion in Iraq, as I mentioned on the previous slide, Operation Ocean Shield, and the bombing in Libya. And so now NATO's influence and their negative impact on peoples across the world are occurring not just in Europe, but occurring throughout Asia and Africa as well. And like I mentioned, the US is seen as the de facto leader. All NATO states have access to NATO military bases around the world. And so you can also see how that's extremely advantageous for US imperial interests. So looking at 2012 to 2023, that's when we really see this focus come into shape as well. 2012, the NATO summit in Chicago is where their pivot to Asia strategy was declared. And so that is the beginning of the points at which they are now starting to also focus on China as an enemy of NATO and as an enemy of the US. In 2014, we'll get into this a little bit more later on, but the US and NATO were found to be involved in anti-Russian coup in Ukraine, which resulted in the installation of a NATO-friendly government that triggered an 8-year civil war in Ukraine prior to the Russian invasion. In 2016 and 2019, and my comrades will get into this more, cyberspace and outer space are now labeled fields applicable to NATO's charter. So the expansion is not even just within sort of physical boundaries, right? We're talking about cyberspace, we're talking about outer space, basically any space in which NATO can continue to expand. The June 2021 NATO summit is where NATO 2030 was discussed. We'll get into that, but the goal of that is stronger engagements with Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And China is then identified as the principal security concern of the alliance, which shows increased presence in the Asia Pacific. In 2022, the war in Ukraine sparks the first direct inter-imperialist confrontation between US and NATO proxies, between the US and Russia. And the Madrid summit brought in South Korean and Japanese leaders to sign the trilateral military agreement, leading to Japan opening the first NATO office in the Pacific in 2023. So now we have the North Atlantic Treaty Organization operating in the Pacific. And then the Russian invasion of Ukraine and subsequent war led to the Nordic expansion, where Sweden and Finland bid to join, and Finland was accepted in 2023. So part of that continued expansion too is what NATO calls the Mediterranean dialogue. That's the NATO partnership with Mediterranean countries. That includes Egypt, Israel, Mauritania, Morocco, Tunisia, Jordan, and Algeria. And in 2006, Israel and NATO agreed to the first international cooperation program, which gives Israel access to a lot of NATO resources, including joint military exercises between Israel and NATO in the Mediterranean. So in the chat, can folks put why you think Israel matters to NATO? And if you want to click on the slide, it'll come up. Yeah, US control in the Middle East. Anyone else? The wedge between Africa and the Middle East. Israel's a testing ground for US NATO weapons. Yes. And if you can click the slide again. So in September 2023, the chair of the NATO Military Committee visited Israel. And sorry, if you can click one more time. That's Admiral Bauer. When he visited Israel, he was invited by President Herzog. He visited multiple IOF officials and was there for several days. This was in September 2023. So he says the ability to fight today's wars as well as prepare for those of tomorrow is fundamental to NATO's deterrence and defense posture. Working with our close partner Israel to counter emerging security challenges and seek out innovative military capabilities helps both of us maintain the military edge against adversaries. So really important in what is said there, right, is thinking about the US adversaries of Iran, thinking about the Israeli adversaries of Iran and also the Palestinians. And so this, right, is really strongly positioning US against Palestine, against Iran, and anyone who is not interested in the normalization. And then just thinking about more expansion, right? So the US in 2014 supported the Ukrainian coup and installed this anti-Russia pro-NATO government. That civil war had caused over 14,000 deaths in Ukraine. And the NATO involvement in the Ukrainian-Russian war sees the additional countries joining the alliance. It also creates pretext for the Russian invasion because they were citing broken promises of expansion. It's important to know that the US was also funding neo-Nazi movements within Ukraine, which has become the Azov Battalion in the Ukrainian army. And ultimately what this did is create an inter-imperialist proxy war between the US and NATO and Russia, none of which have to actually do with Ukrainian sovereignty for the Ukrainian people. It's led to over $100 billion in weapons transfers, half of that from the US. And it's also really important to think about how NATO positions itself as a peacekeeping force. But NATO told Ukraine repeatedly at the beginning of the conflict to reject any peace talks and promised that as long as they rejected peace talks, NATO would continue to fund the Ukrainian army. Can I get a volunteer to read this quote?
Can I get an amen?
Ethan, are you volunteering to read the quote or are you just unmuted? Oh, just unmuted. Okay, anyone else?
It is
Thank you.
urgent to rebuild a global peace movement opposed to all military alliances, demanding their dissolution, a movement opposed as well to the ongoing massive increases in military budgets.
Awesome, thank you, Kate. And now I believe we are going to go into a discussion period.
Yes, thank you, Katie. So for this discussion period, people can either raise their hands or put in the chat, but we wanted to just take a second to see what are people feeling right now after taking in our first two sections of information. So on a scale of 1 to 5, if you could put how you're feeling in the chat about the information. What is surprising about what we've just learned? What questions do you have so far? And how is this history important today? So I can put these questions in the chat, and people can feel free to raise their hands, answer in the chat. But yeah, how are people feeling about what we've learned so far? Okay, so 5, this is good information summarizing decades of US instigated wars. The contrast between what is reported by mainstream media and what is happening is starker than I thought. Oh, sorry, what is 1 and what is 5? I guess that's a good question. What are people feeling? I guess 1, are you feeling like this isn't super surprising? This is pretty mediocre, and maybe I guess 5 is like, wow, this is crazy. I didn't know anything that was said in this presentation up until this point. Okay, very good. And very curious why you didn't mention methane gas fields under Gaza and its cost profits of frustration, but also so appreciative to have these spaces. The comment about methane gas fields under Gaza and its coast and the profits of human trafficking to excuse to attack Muslims around the world in gas/oil/precious conflict minerals. I don't necessarily have, and I don't have a good answer to that question. Okay, thank you, Hope, for responding. We are going to talk about Islamophobia during the counterterrorism pillar. That is going to be coming up in future sections. Okay, how is this history important today? Sorry, I'm trying to pull up. I don't know if anyone had their hand up or anything. It looks like most folks are using the chat.
I think Sammy said that they can respond to the gas question.
Okay, yeah. Go ahead, Sammy. It's all good.
Yeah, my apologies. I just able to turn on my camera right now.
No, you're fine.
Yeah, with talking about like the gas question in Gaza in particular, I know people tend to focus on the gas fields off the Mediterranean coast as being a major reason for like why the Zionist entity of Israel is carrying out the genocide in Gaza and like why the US is backing that. But I do want to emphasize, and this ties back into the resistance part that we're going to get into, is that like Palestinians in Gaza are being punished because they choose to resist imperialism. That really is like the primary factor here. The gas fields, that certainly plays a part, but like really a major portion of what we're seeing right now is because of the resistance against imperialism. And that carries out resistance against the Zionist entity, the US, and NATO, and all those imperialist forces. So I did want to point that out in terms of, and even with Islamophobia, again, like there are many forces within the Arab region, within the Islamic world that like have been resisting imperialism well before 9/11 and things like that. And again, it is like a response, imperialists punishing these countries and these peoples for resisting imperialism. Yeah, just wanted to add that there.
Thank you so much for that addition. That's really good information. Jabrea, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, just to answer some of your questions from before, I think in regards to the scale, I'm between like a 3 and a 4. Like Grace and some other people mentioned in the chat, like it's not surprising, but like this is all really good information, and thank you guys for having this webinar. This has been really good so far. And also, I'm not sure if anyone else is in the same boat as me, but after what happened, everything that's been going on with Israel's war in Gaza, I feel like it was what sparked the, or it brought all of the international problems like into my perspective, I guess. Like I always knew that they were there, but I didn't. And I know that like all of our struggles are interconnected, but I never really understood the depth until this happened and how the US actually has its hand in like every part of the world. So this is all really good information. And it like, now I just want to know all about how to bring it down.
Thank you so much for that reflection. Yeah, it's definitely not, and other folks have already said this in the chat as well, is that this is NATO is extremely expansive, and we could spend hours going into the details of any region and NATO's like true impact on global affairs. And because of how expansive it is, you know, it's hard to keep up with its reach, which is part of why we do these things, why we do education like this, to really, you know, make sure that folks understand how deep US imperialism is and Western imperialism.
I have one more comment.
Yes.
Grace also mentioned about the like how we get the propaganda of NATO. And on the surface, it sounds good, like, oh, like these countries like all made a pact and they're gonna like defend one another, protect peace or whatever. But like you guys mentioned before, as part of the history, that when the Soviet Union tried to join or Russia tried to join, they were rejected. And I think that right there, like, immediately showed what NATO was actually for, and it's not peace at all.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, NATO's reach is very much for the benefit of colonialism, imperialism, militarism. I think peace is very much a facade, as we've learned. Thank you, Jabrea. Okay, let me see if there are other comments I can get to in here. I saw someone commented, when NATO has expanded provocatively to Russia's border, is the war in Ukraine properly characterized as an inter-imperialist conflict? Does someone want to address that question? Sorry, I'm not caught up in the chat, so I'm not sure. I'm trying to figure out if someone has already answered it. Yes, Sarah, you have your hand raised.
I think the major purpose of NATO is to stop the development of any form of economic, political competition or the rise of any country pursuing its own development. And that's why they would target Iran, China, Russia, literally any country. And even within the NATO alliance, there's extreme US competition against the European Union and it developing any independent course. So NATO is really a US vehicle for hegemony in the world and global dominance. And it mattered little the character of Russia or China or Iran that they get targeted, or earlier even smaller countries like Yugoslavia. NATO is a US projection of global dominance and power.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very good analysis. Edie or Eddie, sorry, correct me if I mispronounced that.
Edie, thank you.
Thank you.
In May of 1982, I was working for someone who was working for NATO. And I asked him at the end of the day, oh, how was your day today? What'd you do? And he says, oh, it's mapping all the known methane petroleum reserves in the world. And I said, why? He looked at me like I suddenly lost all credibility and respect. Like he couldn't believe anyone could be so stupid. He used to think I knew something. And I was wondering, and so I again said, why? And he said, because all of our NATO wars are about oil and gas and other resources, and that wars take a long time to plan and fund to get the public agreeing to. So we need to plan ahead which wars we're having when. And I asked, well, like what wars are you having where, when? And he told me every war the United States was going to have that was going to be above the table, known to the public, overt, major, and where it be. And we've had every single one start, kind of officially for the public to know. Every place, every time that he said, except for against Venezuela for the oil. And Russia interfered with that twice. So when they'd suddenly say, oh, we have to do this because they attacked us, or, oh, we have to do something because they did, something bad or something, I already knew when it was going to happen in May 1982, when those people were not in power, those things had not occurred, or some of those people weren't even born yet. So it's made me rather cynical at looking at who is wanting what resources and control over people, and practice at controlling the public's thinking and behavior to get what things. And yes, Israel was founded in order to control that area and to get rid of Jews from Europe and to not pay off the debt that Europeans, Americans, and Canadians owed to Jews. But it was primarily to put anyone there. As Joe Biden said, if Israel didn't exist, we'd have to invent one. But why are other people putting up with the settler colonialism hatred of Israeli Jews against Muslim Christians, Zoroastrian Christian Palestinians? It's because the outside folks, as the United States, can control the resources there they don't want us to know about, as well as the transfer and using it as a huge base in which to bully and control others. So we mustn't forget multiple people have multiple motives and that we need to address in our political action and our education to folks those different motives and how, for example, that is just devastating the climate for people around the world.
Yes, definitely. Sorry, I hate to cut you off. We do have to move on from this section. Thank you so much for your contribution, though, and analysis. I think for that question, we weren't able to answer. Chelsea can answer it in the chat. And then we're gonna, for the when NATO has expanded into Russia's border, we'll answer that in the chat. But we're gonna move on into our next session, discussing NATO's 2030 plan and counterterrorism. So we'll go ahead and hand that over to Hope and Hale. Sorry for folks in the chat who we didn't get to. We are going to have some more time at the end for a question and answer. So I do want to hand it off to Hope and Hale.
Hi, thanks so much for sharing. I'm Hale. I'm with Federungan, and my pronouns are she. So I'll begin by, as I'm sharing this info, I think I would like you all to think about how NATO justifies its expansion by framing certain countries as threats, and how we can combat these narratives and lies that the United States is telling us, not just in hindsight, but moving forward, and how like the same line is used again and again by NATO as it positions itself as like a defender and uplifter of the countries that it occupies. So yeah, could you head to the next slide, please? Okay, great, thank you. So NATO's 2030 plan, their new strategic initiative, it reiterates its commitment to the principle enshrined in Article 5, which is, again, any attack on any member country is a justification for US action, while an attack on the United States justifies like a dragging of other members, NATO members, into a US-led war. And the second thing, the second part of the strategic initiative is that it pledges to, quote, shape the international order, strengthen our engagement with key global actors beyond the Euro-Atlantic area, including from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So some specific examples of this are increasing military training in Colombia, NATO's partner in Latin America, defense capacity building and training with Jordan, Tunisia, and Kuwait, and the expansion of NATO mission Iraq, and developing relations with the League of Arab States and the Gulf Cooperation Council. Also, a major part of the NATO 2030 initiative is the identification of not only Russia, but also China as the principal security concern of the alliance. So this means that NATO will penetrate even further into the Asia-Pacific region, increasing its intelligence activities, investment in military readiness, which includes like weapons, military exercises, base and installations, and collaborations with repressive regimes, and is drive to secure the geopolitical interests of U.S. imperialism. Oh, next slide, please. Thank you. Okay. Another major part of 2030 is that it's strong arming its members to either meet or exceed the target of spending 2% of their GDP on the military, with at least 20% of their military budgets to be spent on arms. So this means that NATO's spending goal directly benefits US weapons. And they also call on the alliance to strengthen its mix of nuclear, conventional, and missile defense capabilities, modernize NATO forces, and strengthen its deterrence posture, including a quote-unquote forward presence in its eastern front and outer space as an operational domain. So I also want to share like the fact that like NATO has always been present in other like countries. So beginning in like not beginning, but like in 2015, there was a staff exchange between NATO and AFRICOM, partnering to like quote unquote mitigate future crises on the African continent. In 2021, the Allies Conference in 2021, they state that the pandemic has quote accelerated every bit of instability in Latin America and the Caribbean, while it increases China's economic dominance, and therefore NATO is able to justify its expansion into those regions. In 2022, NATO and partners from the Indo-Pacific region, Australia, Japan, and the Republic of Korea and New Zealand agree to collaborate around shared security concerns. And in June 2022, at the Madrid summit, NATO heads named the importance of the Indo-Pacific for maintaining Euro-Atlantic security. So continuing with the same event, the meeting at the Madrid summit, South Korea and Japanese heads of state joined for the first time and signed the US, Japan, South Korea trilateral agreement. And there are also numerous bilateral agreements between NATO members and the region, such as the Washington Declaration between the United States and South Korea, the Hiroshima Accords between the UK and Japan, which allow NATO aircraft carriers and nuclear submarines in the two countries' waters. And in the midst of all these agreements, NATO members such as the UK, France, and Germany, countries nowhere near the Pacific, have passed their first ever Indo-Pacific strategies in line with the United States. So, and the NATO 2030 plan, all of them identify China as their main threat. So going back to this expansion into the domain of space, in 2019, like Katie was talking about earlier, there is a recognition of space as a new operational domain, which is alongside air, land, maritime, and cyberspace. So the Defense Innovation Unit, DIU, which is part of the United States Department of Defense, began an effort called the Novel Responsive Space Delivery, which began demonstrating sea-based launch pads in 2023 from a mobile pad atop the Gulf of Mexico. And this is just an example of like the mock-up of the mobile pad. And they say the purpose is to advance commercial operations and respond to real-time threats in space through a dynamic launch and in-orbit operation. So this includes Space Force's rocket cargo effort, as well as its tactically responsive space program. So Space Force, which is a military branch of the United States, defines tactically responsive space as the ability to react quickly to threats. So that could mean launching satellites on a short notice, maneuvering a pre-positioned spare spacecraft to augment a degraded system, or buying data from a commercial partner during a crisis. So this committee also says they are aware that the space domain is contested, and countries such as Russia and China continue to develop and deploy threats on orbit to degrade and destroy US national security satellites. So I ended with that on space, their expansion to space, because if they are able to frame China as like the main enemy of all of NATO, and also like have these definitions of like air, maritime, space, and cyber warfare, that's how they're thinking about borders and territories now, and how they justify their expansion into different regions in order to just like assert dominance in those areas. But also at the same time, their expansion into space is like an overstretching of its own resources. And it's kind of like they're trying to push really hard to enter these spaces, and they're stretching themselves thin. And they also have to frame these like future threats as all like either like terrorist threats or like threats they have to defend against. And they're just really like using a lot of resources in order to do all this. So I hope that like segues well into Hope's part about counterterrorism.
Thanks, Hale. Hi, everyone. I'm Hope from Katurungan, DC. And so, yeah, I'm going to be talking about how NATO uses the concepts of terrorism and counterterrorism strategically in order to advance its goals. And I do want to say, like, I know this can be a challenging topic for myself and others to think about because mass violence is a real force. And I think it's important to grapple with the role of violence in freedom struggles and hold space for emotions that a word like terrorism evokes. There's like a lot of propaganda, but there's also the reality of like lives being lost. So I kind of want to think about both the strategy of labeling groups as terrorists by NATO, but also give you a little bit of time to reflect on what like these words bring up for you. So just for 1 minute, if everyone can brainstorm, like you could write it down, you could just think in your head about like, yeah, just what is terrorism and why would NATO engage in so-called counterterrorism? Okay, that's been 1 minute. Does any brave soul want to share some of their reflections? Maybe someone we haven't heard from yet? Okay, Sophia, I don't think we've heard from you yet.
Sure. They probably have one that's a little spicy, and I'd love to be sort of talked out of it or whatever. But so like to me, this is especially relating to being a teenager during 9/11 and having people, I didn't understand why it was a big deal at all. And so I wrote, terrorism is when white people are killed en masse. And I know it's more complicated than that, but like it just didn't make any sense to me when 9/11 happened that there was such a huge response because I was like, people die in large amounts all over the place all the time. What's going on?
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I think that that's like something that definitely want to grapple with is how like terrorism is a term that applies to some people but not others in the US. So just going back to some of the history that Katie walked us through, NATO's counterterrorism pillar was first conceptualized during the deployment of NATO troops to Afghanistan, which those troops were there from 2003 to 2014. And the pillar has rapidly evolved in tandem with the US led quote unquote war on terror. And it includes both land-based and sea-based border security activities, direct combat, and widespread surveillance of people around the world. I think if you want to learn more about like NATO's counterterrorism activity, they describe their activities in pretty like serious detail on their website. So if you're interested, definitely go read those like primary sources. You can go to the next slide, Mirsha. So we like again, looking at NATO's strategic use of terror and counterterrorism, it's a way to violently repress resistance. This comic on the screen shows it was made by a Sikh like artist, and just sort of in 2003 and like deals with how turbans were made to signify individuals as terrorists after 9/11, when those Sikh people in the US faced pretty serious attacks at their places of worship, et cetera. And so terrorism is a way for the US and its allies to label people who are non-white and non-Christian today, mostly Muslim people, in order to more easily control them. It's nothing new. It's been happening for a really long time. The like specific groups of people change, but the rhetoric remains the same. And in labeling certain groups of people as terrorists, NATO collaborates with Interpol by using its military to collect information and then shares that information with law enforcement agencies and vice versa. So it's sort of a military police reciprocal relationship. And then on the second point, it's a way to promote Islamophobia, racism, and a sense of American exceptionalism. So here, like, terrorism is a rhetorical tool where NATO member countries position themselves as saviors and rescuers of oppressed people. This happened a lot in the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, where, like, you know, terrorists are oppressors of women and LGBTQ people, but meanwhile, NATO armed forces and the US military were, like, you know, raining extreme forms of violence against all civilians, regardless of their gender, sexuality, or whatever, and also against the environment, economies. And then on this last point, terrorism is a way to create a sense of crisis, instability, and chaos. So for the past many decades, but especially since October 7th, Israel has positioned itself as facing exceptional vulnerability, quote unquote, which results in, again, quotes, exceptional security needs that justify exceptional counterterrorism technologies. The US recycles Israel's declaration of possible terror risks, and it drums up popular support for the war on terror globally. And especially this stuff about, you know, the need to develop exceptional counterterrorism technologies. A lot of those technologies are, you know, created in the United States or in Israel. We can go to the next slide. Does anyone want to read the words on this slide? This is NATO describing what terrorism is.
I will. Terrorism in all its forms and manifestations is the most direct asymmetric threat to the security of our citizens and to international peace and prosperity. Terrorist organizations seek to attack or inspire attacks against allies. They have expanded their networks, enhanced their capabilities, and invested in new technologies to improve their reach and lethality. Non-state armed groups, including transnational terrorist networks and state-supported actors, continue to exploit conflict and weak governance to recruit, mobilize, and expand their foothold.
Thank you, Mary. Yeah, so I just wanted to read out this definition because I think, to me, like, reading through the lines, reading between the lines is like, it basically can apply to anyone. Like, it's a very flexible definition. And so it's a really like useful device in that way because it can just be applied to anyone. Next slide. And so going a little bit more into the counterterrorism pillar, I hope you guys can see this, it's kind of small, but this was like me just looking at the counterterrorism website that NATO put together, or like the page on NATO's website. And so this first quote up here that I highlighted in green, NATO operates in full respect of Iraq's sovereignty and territorial integrity and coordinates and consults closely with other international partners like Global Coalition, the United Nations, and the European Union. I just read that and I thought it was pretty ridiculous to read, especially knowing what we know now about the United Nations, with the US, you know, vetoing things lately with regards to Israel. So it's just, I don't know, I think they're just kind of showing themselves for what they are. I also wanted to highlight these two things in the red boxes here on the left. This is, again, NATO describing for itself what the counterterrorism pillar is. And so this recently appointed Secretary General Special Coordinator for Counterterrorism is this man here, Thomas Goffis. He has a long, successful career in the US Armed Forces. He's worked for the US Senate Armed Services Committee. So he's just like kind of, you know, been like, he's just come up in the ranks of US imperialism and militarism. And then this second red box on the left here says NATO supports the development of new capabilities and technologies to tackle the terrorist threat and to manage the consequences of a terrorist attack. So yeah, I think that just underscores the role of technology and how the US and Israel are the ones developing those technologies. Yeah, that's all from me.
Thank you so much, Hope and Hale, for that very thorough section. All right, this is, we're coming up on our last section before Q&A. So take it away, Cody.
Awesome. Thank you, Mary Shea. thank you to everyone. Can we get a huge shout out to all the presenters from the Resist NATO Education Committee for putting together this really incredible webinar? What I really hope that all of you who are attending this right now are getting is that this is dispelling many myths about NATO. One of those myths being that NATO is only focused on Europe, that NATO is just European member states focused on European security. And the other one is that NATO is here to protect us, that we need it. It is to help us go up against the big, scary states that are trying to attack us. What we are trying to push with this campaign is that, one, NATO is everywhere. It is not just in Europe. It is focused all over the world. And two, NATO is counter-revolutionary. It only exists to serve the US and Western imperialist interests. It only exists to keep the people down. So what does that mean? We have to keep rising up against NATO. And the good news is that this has happened ever since NATO came into existence. And unfortunately, we do not have enough time to go through all the history of resistance to NATO. But the fortunate part about that is that if we did have the time, we'd be talking about this for days. People have been rising up against NATO from the beginning up until now. And the whole reason we're having this webinar is because we're looking to continue the tradition when NATO is here in DC, this July. So if we jump to the next slide, I'm just going to highlight a few of these, just a few key points of NATO resistance to give us some inspiration. I'm going to first focus on these 6 points that I found that were interesting of resistance within NATO countries themselves. And the first happened in Iceland. And this actually happened at the very beginning of NATO in 1949. Again, another myth is that NATO has been united ever since the beginning. These were different countries that all had all the people of these countries had a shared understanding and interest in this alliance, and they all went into it willingly and excitedly. That is not the case in the slightest. So much so that, in fact, in 1949, when the NATO Charter was being written and Iceland was coming in as a member, there was mass opposition, so much that if you see that upper left picture, that is actually like firebombing that people did of a local government office because they were so in opposition of their government bringing them into this US-led alliance after the horrors of World War II that people saw, rightly so, as would continue the root causes of conflict going forward. There was actually members of parliament that were pretty much kept hostage by people saying, we are not going to let you go unless you refuse to sign us onto the charter. Unfortunately, the Icelandic government did sign on, but this history it's kept out of the history books that there was such massive opposition in at least one NATO member country, so much so that people were ready to actually take their government hostage to bring attention to the fact that the people were being kept hostage and their democracy was being crushed on in order to expand the US-led war machine. Happened many more years going forward, but since 1949, we've had NATO summits in different countries. Each year, there's a different country that the NATO summit happens in. That brings us to this year, 75 years later, when the US will once again host the NATO summit. But in 1981, they were hosted in Germany. And so in 1981, there's a picture here of protesters who are protesting against NATO's pursuit of the nuclear arms race during the beginning of the 80s was one of the most tense times of the potential for nuclear war. And so here's a protester that's dressed like Uncle Sam and having this name tag that says Reagan and holding a nuclear bomb. And there's someone dressed as a skeleton next to him. You jump to the next slide, we'll see some more pictures. This is also a very crucial piece of history. So I really appreciate what Katie was walking us through about where Ukraine currently fits into this. Again, another myth. We are told that the war in Ukraine was just because Russia, or what we're often just said, Putin, we take all of this geopolitical significance and put it onto one person. Like that's how history always is. But it's saying Putin or Russia is just expansionist and trying to get into Ukraine, and that's why NATO is arming Ukraine to defend itself. Well, remember the history. We said NATO has been looking to have Ukraine as a member for years and has been looking for excuses for this. And this is just another excuse where NATO literally lit a fuse for a proxy war many years ago. And actually, we can look back to 2006 when Ukraine was added into what NATO's program calls a quote unquote partnership for peace. The fact that NATO has any word about peace in it is pretty ridiculous. But it's usually the first step that will eventually lead to NATO membership. And when you add this country that's right on Russia's borders, Russia being the country that NATO has always pointed out as its main enemy, we know that we're getting close to a huge conflict. And so there was a military exercise that happened in Ukraine from NATO for the Partnership for Peace. And there were mass oppositions. And here's pictures from a sit-in at the government in Kiev of people, saying, fighting back, like, no, we do not want our country to join NATO. Looking what would happen, a decade and a half after this mass protest. Of course, the people were right of what would happen to their country when this started to happen. Now there's a picture in France down below. So you remember all the fire we saw in Iceland in 1949. Here's similar fires of people taking to the streets in 2009 in Strasbourg when NATO summit was held in France. Tens of thousands of people took to the streets. If you jump to the next slide, we'll see a really great resistance to NATO, which was 2012, when the NATO summit was held in Chicago in the US. And two significant things happened regarding this campaign. One, NATO announced or the US Obama administration announced its pivot to Asia when it would focus on the Asia and Pacific region as its main strategic military economic zone. What also happened was there were mass protests, which culminated in the launch of the U.S. country chapter of the International League of People Struggle, which is the organization, the alliance that is really driving the Resist NATO coalition this year. So ILPS in the U.S. has a very rich history of resisting NATO. It's literally how we were born. It's what we're going to do with everyone else in this coalition in D.C. this summer. And then ILPS members also took part with members of other organizations in 2002, mobilizing to Madrid when the NATO summit happened in Spain. And this was also a very crucial NATO summit because it was the first one since the proxy war in Ukraine started. It was also when Japan and Korea were brought on to sign the U.S. trilateral military agreement in the Pacific. So you can see there were people from all over the world marching down the streets of Madrid. I remember being there and just feeling the power of what it felt like to be part of a mass movement. So these are just some examples of what resistance has looked like within NATO countries. Again, if we listed out every single year, we'd be here for days, which I love to talk about resistance for days. But we got to get ready to start planning our own resistance. So I will jump to the next slide to finish by showing pictures of examples of NATO resistance everywhere. Because remember, NATO isn't just in Europe. It's everywhere. And people have resisted NATO in countries all over the world because they see its impact on them. It sees how their families are torn apart. It sees how their economies are torn apart. It is seen how their communities are militarized because of NATO action. So there's pictures here, not just against NATO alliance itself, but against the operations that individual NATO countries do, like the examples of US and France and their neo-occupations and colonial ventures in Africa today, and people fighting back against this. This may not be done by NATO as an alliance, but the NATO alliance gives the strength and justification for these individual countries to continue their imperialist ventures. So I'm just showing examples here, pictures from Niger, from Libya saying no, and then the banner, the massive banner you can see here was during NATO's bombing campaign in Libya, and it says, "No foreign intervention. Libyan people can manage it alone." That is what this campaign is pushing for. National sovereignty and independence and solidarity between peoples, not foreign intervention. Pictures from Iraq against the US and NATO occupation. Pictures of resistance in Australia in the lower left-hand corner when people were protesting against NATO operations, how it was impacting the Pacific. So again, it could go on forever. I could have a whole collage that lasts many, many slides of what these pictures can be. Let's add our own pictures, our own piece of history this summer, this July, when we all take to the streets against NATO together. And with that, that is the end of this very short section on resistance to NATO.
Thank you so much, Cody. That was awesome. Okay, guys, we are kind of starting to wrap up here. So we have another question and answer session. We're going to go until about 1:20 on this. So if folks could either raise your hand, put any lingering questions you have in the chat. If you have any comments too about this kind of second half of this presentation, we can go ahead and continue to analyze and reflect. Sophie put in the chat someone doing a sit-in to resist Cop City in Atlanta. Yeah, Cop Cities are popping up all over America, and they were charged with terrorism, of course, because anyone resisting the state is a terrorist. Yes, definitely good connection to draw. Parvata, is that how you pronounce your name?
Yeah, my name is pronounced Parvata. But anyway, I actually wanted to ask if you could speak a little bit more about I guess the cooperation between weapons contractors, especially weapons contractors based in the US with NATO. Especially as there's this rise of anti-militarization efforts on college campuses to get weapons manufacturers off of our campuses. So I wanted to know what are the links to NATO as well that we could speak on later.
That's a really good question. Does anyone of our presenters would like to take that question? I would say generally NATO as an institution is just primarily militaristic, so not only providing a whole military, but also, benefiting off of weapons provided to the military is definitely, part of the sorry, I lost my train of thought. Cody, go ahead.
Yeah. No, you're spot on. And then a concrete example of this is that oftentimes you will see CEOs and other officials of weapons companies who come and attend NATO summits. You're literally seeing the leaders of the war industry who profit off the most. They come to these military strategic forums. So you think that they're just for government. The military contractors and the weapons companies are at every single step with them. So Parvata, I think it's a very great point that you brought up there in terms of how we're going after both the states that are directing war and the companies who are profiting off of the weapons being sold.
Thank you, Cody. And thank you for that question, Parvata. Okay, someone says in the chat, a large percentage of the military spending by the NATO member states are mandated to be spent on arms. Okay, yeah, that's also a good contribution to that question. Yeah, thinking about how those companies are recruiting students. It's interesting to see how the political and economic interests of these NATO countries manifest. Yeah, definitely. Right. Are there any other questions, reflections?
A reflection that I had that I was kind of sitting on while listening to the webinar was how none of this or everything that the US has done has really like never been for the benefit of the people, just which I think is like so interesting. Like one of the richest countries in the world, but homelessness is such a huge problem here. People can't afford health care. And so when I think about it, it's like, why are we doing this for this like small percentage of people? And I don't know, it's just like baffling. It's mind-boggling that they can afford all this stuff, but no one on the ground like reaps the benefits of it. Not that there are any, not when it comes at the expense of like the people of other nations. But yeah, that's just something that yeah, Kate, exactly what you said.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, institutions like NATO, and there are many others, are really just ways to perpetuate capitalism and benefit off of the backs of, especially off of the backs of like working folks, many marginalized groups, for the benefit of a very, very small percentage of people. Thank you for that comment. Okay. I'm not seeing any other questions. So I think maybe we can go ahead and move forward to our closing section, which is our call to action. A lot of you all have already asked about this in the chat. So we're finally here. How do you continue to get involved? How do we make history for ourselves and actually resist NATO? One thing that we are asking of folks is, if this presentation really compelled you and brought a lot of information to you and makes you want to get more involved, we have an open meeting for all this upcoming Wednesday, June 12th. If you're on Pacific time, it's 4:30 to 6 p.m. If you're on Eastern time, it's 7:30 to 9 p.m. So registration and sign up is at our link tree. It's just linktree/resist NATO. This is to help get prepared for NATO's visit coming on July 9th through 11th. So we are ready to resist and oppose it. And we hope that this presentation is helping you all get ready to resist and oppose it and to get more involved. So that is one of our plugs for today. And then if we could go to the next slide, here's some additional things we would like to bring to everyone's attention, ways to get more involved. So just to continue ways that we're preparing for NATO's visit, this webinar, of course, was one of our first events. You can join the NATO coalition, the Resist NATO coalition, not the NATO, don't join NATO. So you can join as an organization. I myself and some of my fellow presenters are already part of an organization, Katarungan DC, which is a solidarity organization for folks in the Philippines, but some of our other presenters are part of various different organizations too, so you can join that way. Or you can also join individually, just join a committee to help plan our activities and carry out the campaign. So we have lots of committees to choose from. If you're not yet part of an organization, I recommend also joining one just to continue your activism. But if you're not sure where to go first, joining a committee here is certainly a good first step to start. Number two, stay informed and organize others to resist NATO. So we do have an Instagram, which is just at resist.nato. And then we have a link tree too, which I already plugged earlier, but you can get some of the information that we've talked about today and continue to stay updated on the events leading up to NATO's visit at both of those, the Instagram and the link tree. We have an additional webinar coming up. It is understanding, it's going a little bit more into depth. As we talked about, we could go on and on and on about NATO's involvement and its reach across the world. So our next webinar touches on that and goes into depth about that, understanding the US, EU, NATO axis of domination in Africa and the Americas. So be sure to put that in your calendar. It's going to be on June 20th. On the left side is our sort of flyer for that. So June 20th, 4 p.m. Pacific time, 6 p.m. Central, 7 p.m. Eastern time. The online registration is similar to this registration, but instead it's just tinyurl.com/resistnato2. So if you enjoyed this presentation, you're really going to enjoy that one because it goes a lot into depth about some things we only briefly touched on today. So please feel free to register for that soon. And lastly, June 20, well, not lastly, but almost last, June 24th, our Day of Action and Press Conference with Cancel RIMPAC. So make sure to get that in your calendar as well. I don't remember what the how to deacronize RIMPAC. If someone who could do that in the chat, just so everyone is the same on this. Thank you, Cody. Rim of the Pacific. Just so everyone has access to, so the language is accessible. Sorry. Okay, so June 24th, Day of Action and Press Conference with Cancel RIMPAC. If we could go to our next slide for our final, everything leading up to NATO's visit. So we have the People's Summit, July 6th, and mobilization on July 7th. So make sure to, again, go to the link tree to register for that. Save those dates in your calendar. This is where we get just as Cody was talking about in their section of the presentation, people have been resisting NATO for decades and decades. And this is kind of what all of this education is leading up to, is to our own resistance against NATO's aggression and war provocation. So this is where we, all of the people can come together and mobilize against this neo-colonial and anti-revolutionary NATO. So thank you all so much for coming to this presentation. I don't know if any of my fellow presenters have additional comments that they want to leave our participants with. But yeah, thank you all so much for coming. Please save these dates in your calendar and continue to resist NATO and resist all anti-imperialistic institutions. Or resist all imperialist institutions. Thanks, everybody.